That was an excellent presentation, and I always find when we have this caliber of guests, if we can ask questions, we really understand a lot more about the industry. And the next two presenters will be equally as dynamic. Anthony Parker is a commissioner with Plant Breeders' Rights with CFIA, and Carla St. Croix is a director with Innovation and Growth Policy Division. I didn't even know we actually had that, but it sounds impressive. And super wheat. I think all Western Canadian wheat is super wheat, actually. Anthony and Carla have graciously agreed to attend here today to update us on value creation. This is not their plan, but they are charged with informing producers and gaining feedback. I would ask that we all keep our comments brief to allow everyone an opportunity and respectful. I think we'll live up to our old license plate friendly Manitoba by the end of the day. I think one thing we all can agree upon is that we need public wheat and barley breeding in Western Canada. There have been a number of reports, Dr. Gray, the Garvin and GRG report that are on our website, actually, some of them. The funding in public breeding is eroding, both in people and funding. Farmers in some of our competing countries are spending significantly more in breeding than we are, and it's been hard to get that on producers' radars, but in 2 short months, these two have managed to do that, so thank you very much for that. They are going to give us a presentation, and we're going to hold questions till after. If that, we probably won't have time to pass mics around, so if you could stand up and introduce yourself, and we'll maybe repeat the questions from the mics. So please help me welcome Carla and Anthony.
Hi, I'm always shorter than everyone else. It's not fair. Hang on. There we go. Perfect. So there's a lot of buzz in the room, so I'm going to try to stay focused, I guess. But I wanted to say, first of all, that it's really, really fun to be back in Brandon because I went to university here, got to drive by the university, so I'm really happy to be back here. And I'm originally from Manitoba, so it's nice to be here. So I am going to try to move at lightning speed through the first half, and I'm going to make Anthony do the same thing through the second half of this presentation, because we really want to hear from you. We want to hear your comments. We want to hear your questions, and we'll be around after as well if you want to chat with us after for a little bit. So really the point of today's presentation is to give you a sense of what is it that we are doing with this consultative process. So what are the objectives of the consultative process? A bit of background and contextual information on why is it that we're talking about this at all. And then an overview of 2 models that the Grains Roundtable recommended that AAFC and CFIA do further calculations on, so that's what we're here for. And then to outline some key questions and considerations. So lots of stuff in this presentation. We will share versions with the organizing committee. I think we already have with Ag Days, so that you can get your hands on a copy and look at it and touch base with us after as well. So fundamentally, and I think this is hopefully an objective that people will return to and think about as I'm walking through the first half and as Anthony continues to walk through the presentation. Really the ultimate objective, certainly the ultimate objective of AAFC as an organization and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is to really look at how we ensure the continued profitability. Innovation is right in my job title, and then competitiveness of the sector and farmers. So you comprise a fundamental part of the agriculture and agri-food sector. And so driving really the fundamental component of this is that's the end game. It's not to add additional costs without having greater return to producers. So really it is that profitability, that competitiveness. What are the desired outcomes of sessions like these is really to ensure that you have all the information you need about this topic, to make sure that you have clarity on some of the questions that you're asking about, whether it's the models or the need for a model at all. and also to have a bit of an opportunity to provide a bit of feedback on some of those models. Want to make it crystal clear, there's been no decision made. We're here to talk. We're here to hear your views and to listen to all of those views and take it back, think them through, and continue to refine our thinking. And finally, everything here will inform next steps. So this is a bit of process heavy right now. We're going to get into content really quickly. So how did we get here? So really, there's a Grains Roundtable, which is one of the value chain roundtables run by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. It comprises about 200 organizations of the grains sector. And that roundtable struck what was called a value creation working group. And they took a look at this issue over a period of 2 years and came up with a couple of models in terms of how to perhaps address some of these, at the crux of it, investment challenges that exist in the grains, and specifically the cereals sector, and then honed in again on wheat. So those 2 years, that may seem like a long period of time, but before that, the grain sector was grappling with this topic for over a decade. So that being said, this is the first time that Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency have launched a set of consultations on this topic. So now we are in this effort to make sure the widest group of individuals can be consulted. That's why we're here today. That's where Anthony and I are kind of going a little bit across Canada. And we are engaging with as many folks as we can to get your views. We're going to have online consultations. That's kind of our next step after we do these. We've had 5 in-person formal consultations. You can see where we've held them. We're moving into an online phase, hopefully more like February rather than March. It's not a document that's going to go up one day and get pulled down the next. It'll be up there for probably about 120 days. It'll be up on Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and CFIA's websites for everyone to read, have a look at. It'll give you lots of detail and ask lots of questions, and we'll take that feedback and think about it and then reassess next steps. One of those next steps we know that's going to happen is we will do additional sessions. I'm guessing we're going to need some more sessions of a formal nature, while we are also engaging many informal sessions like this one. And finally, there is not a final step on here. In our formal consultation process, we did indicate at that additional session step that it was a final wrap-up. That was never intended to be like a final last time we're ever going to talk about it. We will assess next steps after this kind of chunk March, April, and then we will decide how to move forward as a group collectively with yourselves. So this slide was really intended to provide a little bit of contextual information on what the Grains Roundtable, those grains stakeholders, including producer associations, grappled with for over a decade and over the last couple years. And AFC has also thought about these sorts of challenges along with my colleague Anthony. So you see that declining trend line, not just for wheat, but also for things like barley and oats. And that's not that we want to have necessarily that acreage trend line change. It's more, that was a symptom for us. We were like, well, what's running in behind that declining acreage? And it's also not lost on us that crops like wheat are critical, and cereals, to breaking pest and disease cycles. And, you know, the $9 billion to the Canadian economy, and farm cash receipts pretty high as well, in and around $6 billion. That's not lost on us either. So wheat is critical. Cereals are critical for producers. We want to be sure they also remain profitable. And I understand there is profitability, but one of the top profitable crops, so that you have all of the crops that you get to choose from as profitable options. What we have found is running behind that are investment challenges. Lots of other things at play with declining acreage, no doubt about it. But one of the cruxes is investment. So what do we see? Well, we see when plant breeding, I don't think I've ever read a study, and this I'm just going to touch on really quickly, but you can see the numbers. Any study you look at plant breeding, there's never been one that gives you a negative return. So when you invest in plant breeding, there are strong returns, and not just to the sector as a whole, but to producers. You get anywhere between 7 to 1 and 12 to 1 if you're looking at studies done by the Crop Development Center, and then there's a host of other studies here. Happy to provide links to studies if folks want to look at those in more detail. So this slide is kind of the crux of the challenge, and I think probably one of the areas where there's a bit of discomfort is just that farm-saved seed. I want to say right from the beginning, there is no intention to remove the ability to save seed. The notion is there a reason here to start to think about conditions on farm-saved seed so that there can be the right level of investment going back into breeding so that that will drive up returns for you as farmers when you're making decisions around varieties that you just talked about in the last panel, having the best varieties, not just yield-wise, but quality-wise to grow on your farm. So we've seen private sector investment because of that high level of farm-saved seed use, where there's no royalty flow back to public or private institutions, this investment level, particularly in the private sector, is reflective of that dynamic. So you have about 14%, and that's the latest data, as a share of overall private sector investment going into crops, cereals crops, whereas canola, corn, soybeans, where you have traits and hybridization and technical use agreements, you can see that that return has driven up that private sector investment. That doesn't mean that public sector will back away. That is not the intent at all. Public sector will stay. The idea is that you have public sector, and with the right investment climate, that coupling with the private sector, and then better varieties for producers. So just getting into this slide is really what a future sector could look like if a model like this came into being. So overall investment grows. There's no desire to, say, have private sector move in and/or our other public sector breeders. So AFC is not the only public sector breeder, clearly. We have the Crop Development Center and other public sector breeders. But to see that overall investment grow. So no displacement of investment, but additional investment into the system. Public sector maintains a prominent role. We don't want to duplicate some of the poor decisions of some of our competitors where there's an exit and you lose a decade of work because you've exited that public prominent role. So public sector retains a prominent role. Private sector and other public sector players have more of an investment capabilities, and you have a better kind of choice. And so then producers retain choice. So it's not that all varieties in the marketplace are intended to have royalties associated with them. There'll be royalty-free varieties as well as those with royalties. And ultimately, it'll be your choice in this kind of a system to decide, do I want to grow that variety that looks like it might hold more potential? Or do I want to grow this other variety, which is doing pretty good for me, and I want to continue to do that, and you'll have a choice. And then transition over time. Not going to flick a switch and have everything be all with royalties or everything be the same, but that over kind of a period of time, you'll see some new varieties come in place, and there's this magical date of February 2015 of where the Plant Breeders' Rights Act was updated, where that is, we cannot go back any earlier than that. But that's really that's a starting point, and the starting point can shift to be later if that's the desire. But regardless, you look at jurisdictions like Australia, took about 12 to 15 years of a transition. So it's not going to happen overnight. And that's if there's a agreement to move forward. So one of the questions that came up time and again throughout AFC and CFIA's formal consultations, and it's coming up in some of the informal events we're doing as well, is just, well, the wheat market's saturated. And there were some questions around wheat prices in the panel discussion earlier. So in terms of wheat prices, we can't control prices. Don't think we want to be in that world. And Canada tends to be a bit of a price taker. But in terms of wheat prices and what our research and analysis directorate has looked at, wheat prices themselves are looked to stay about at 2017-18 levels for the near term, and then in the medium term to grow moderately about 2.5%. So that's kind of at least what we're seeing for prices. In terms of, is the wheat market exhausted? It's not, right? So we're seeing trend lines, and these are out to 2027, that both wheat production and consumption is going to increase. So, and then global wheat exports themselves are expected to increase as well. And again, you do, and I think Joanne touched on it quite nicely to say, there are competitors out there. And if we're going to, and this is not Joanne, this is me, but if you're going to compete, I think innovation is a nice way to try to do that. So with that, I challenge Anthony to go through 10 minutes.
Thanks very much, Carla, and let me just say what a pleasure it is to be here in Manitoba. I always enjoy coming here. I wish I would get here a little bit more in the summer and less in the winter time. That seems to be the time I spend the most time here, but of course that is meeting season. So I'm going to take you a little bit through some of the more technical aspects and the legal aspects of what's being proposed. As Carla mentioned, this discussion around how do you incentivize greater levels of investment in plant breeding, and particularly cereals, is not a new concept. It's been around for well over a decade. Discussions started, I think, going back to the early 2000s. In fact, in the grain industry, an attempt was made by a Canadian Sea Trade Association, facilitated discussion to look at models. More recently, 2015, Western Grains Research Foundation, along with the commissions, also commissioned a paper and a study to how do you incentivize greater investment. And as this was going on, we were sort of thinking in the background, well, if there's interest here and the sector wants to move in this direction, government should be sort of proactive about it and sort of start thinking about a framework on how this could be accommodated. And when we passed in 2015 amendments to the Plant Breeders' Rights Act to conform to the most recent International Convention for Intellectual Property Protection, we built in what was regulation-making authority, thinking into the future, if the sector as a whole wants to move in this direction, how can we accommodate it? So that's what we did. And that would be through the creation of regulation sometime in the future. The key thing, and government was crystal clear at the time, and our commitment maintains that, we will not advance until thorough consultations are being taken place on the subject. And really that's what we're in the midst right now. And as Carla said, no decision has been taken. We have two models that have been proposed to government, and I'll take you through that in a little bit more detail. But first, a little bit on the drivers for change and what we see happening. When we strengthen that intellectual property environment here in Canada, we saw some companies start to dip their toe into the water and see Canada as perhaps an attractive place to invest. Two such examples, Lima Grain, and if you don't know about Lima Grain is a French agricultural cooperative owned by farmers in France. It's one of the largest breeding companies in the world for cereal. They established a footprint here in Canada. So did Bayer at Pike Lake, Saskatchewan, seeing a greater interest in investing here. And really what we're talking about here is Canada's ability to attract investment, not only from foreign sources, but also from homegrown sources as well. Some of the most interesting conversations that I've seen is with the producer community saying, why don't we start our own breeding company? I'm the first to go, yeah, that's exactly what I want to hear. The challenge a little bit in the current environment is how do you get a return on investment? Even if you want to be a not-for-profit breeding company, how do you maintain that investment in the long term? And the current structure that we have in place does not allow that to happen. As Carl indicated, we're looking at additional investments, so no departure of the public sector. In fact, maintenance of that role, and for certain public sector entities, additional royalties could actually strengthen and bolster their programs. I think about flax. Flax worries me. Flax, we are down to one public sector breeder at the University of Saskatchewan, at least in Western Canada. A little bit's happening in Quebec. A couple of years ago, we had 3 flax breeders. We had Viterra that was interested in there was AAFC program, and now we're down to CDC. Flax still a viable crop, still needs attention, still needs genetic improvement in that area. The biggest thing that keeps me up at night, and Joanne Booth touched on it earlier, is what about our competitiveness internationally? We know that there's about 8 countries jockeying for position in the world export market, Canada being one of them. This time last year, I got a call from Ukraine, said, we're really interested in this value creation concept. Can you tell us a little bit about that model? We're thinking about something here in Ukraine. That worries me. November, I was in Geneva at an international meeting. Kazakhstan ran up to me and said, wow, I hear you're interested in some models, implementing some models. You know, we're thinking about the same here. You know, where are we going to be positioned globally in our ability to both invest in research and development cereals, but also attract investment at the global level? And of course, we're not forerunners in this area. Other countries have implemented these mechanisms with certain successes, and I will go through the pros and cons of those. More specifically, Australia, France, and the UK, but also several other European countries, a few South American countries as well have these models in place. Essentially, the recommendations from the Grain Roundtable arrived at 2 models. One was an endpoint royalty and one is the farm-safe seed royalty. And I'll try to take you through a brief schematic. Don't worry about it. This stuff will be posted online in the near future so you can go through in detail. An endpoint royalty, what is that essentially? Well, that's a royalty on harvested grain. So you would have qualified varieties under the proposed system that would be eligible for an endpoint royalty. The producer would pay at the time that they delivered that grain to the grain buyer, so at the elevator. A couple things to consider about this model. One is it does require cooperation of the grain buyers to be involved in the process of collecting royalties. We also have a situation whereby our law that would underpin this says you can't double dip. So you can't be in a situation where you paid a royalty on certified seed, then deliver it and collect a royalty on the harvested material. So there would have to be some sort of rebate or exemption system in place, or a movement of that certified seed royalty to the back end. Those are all options. So it adds a layer of complication. But there's also an opportunity for producer commissions, if they're interested or willing, to be part of the administration and collection of these royalties. So that's one option for consideration. The other option is a trailing royalty system on farm-safe seed. So as a producer, you would buy one of these new varieties that were eligible to have farm-safe seed royalty attached to it. You paid on the certified seed, you grow your crop, you harvest it, there's a portion that you want to retain and use for the next year. You'd enter into a contract with that developer to pay X amount that you continue to save and reuse that seed on an annual basis. So those are fundamentally the 2 types of concepts that were arrived at the Grains Roundtable and turned over to government and asked that we consult on it. From our perspective, it's not much of a surprise because internationally, most countries who decide to go down this route either end up at one or both, or either one of these models. So to illustrate, France and Australia have moved more to that endpoint royalty type system. United Kingdom, Argentina, Netherlands, Germany have opted for more of that farm-safe seed royalty type system. So one of the advantages of perhaps not being a front runner in this area is you get to learn from others and based on what they have done, what works, what doesn't work, and what might be suitable for Canada. And I can tell you the one thing as I study these models very hard is everyone has its pros and cons, and everyone is slightly different. And what they've done is developed systems. There might be commonalities in approach, farm-safe seed or endpoint royalty, but there's very specific conditions and nuances to the context of that country that have to be taken into consideration. So you can learn from others, but at the end of the day, you have to build your own system. Just so you get a flavor of what's out there, France, it's an endpoint royalty, harvested on soft white wheat. It's at 0.70 euros per ton, collected across the board. divvied up based on market share to the various entities that are in wheat breeding, and 15% is reserved for public-private partnerships. Generally, it's perceived to have a very low administrative footprint and works very effectively. UK, it's on farm safe seed. It's a flat rate across the board. A little complicated. It's based on EU law that it has to be sensibly lower than certified seed rate of royalty, so it ends up being 52.5% of the previous year's aggregate on certified seed. So a little bit more complicated, but it is collected largely by invoicing by mobile seed cleaners. In the UK, it seems to have a little bit higher administrative footprint, nudging towards about 10% for administrative costs. Australia, an endpoint royalty. It's not a fixed rate, it's a variable rate. Breeders choose the rate that they want to set. What we've seen, the history of Australia happen is it bumped up a little bit for the rates, and then there was a market correction because farmers weren't buying those expensive varieties, and now it's settling in around that $1 to $4 per ton royalty rate on the harvested material. In the context of Australia, they had royalty-free varieties and royalty varieties, EPR varieties, in the marketplace for a considerable period of time through that transition. So if you were a developer of a variety, you really had to create some value pull to move producers off those royalty-free varieties. And just a little case study in terms of Australia and what we've seen. In Australia, they took a decision for the public sector to exit plant breeding. That's not what we're talking about for Canada. But in the year 2000, the public sector invested about 18 million Australian dollars into plant breeding. Through a 15-year period, they were able to transition that over to the private sector and generate about $45 million in annual investment. So quite a large bump in breeding activities. They are also, and if you don't know too much about breeding, breeding is a numbers game. You're going to have success the more crosses, the more families, the more lines that you can handle, and the more plots you can put in the field. It is really finding that needle in the haystack that is the real winner. In Australia alone, one company puts in 250,000 yield trial plots on a year. In all of Canada's wheat breeding programs, we don't get anywhere close to that combined. It's 800 to 1,000. So having that ability of sifting through a lot of genetic material to find the winners is critically important. And we heard Dr. Richard Gray's study mentioned earlier, Carla mentioned Dr. Richard Gray. He did some analysis on the Australian model and indicated that if we had that here in Canada over a 40-year period, we would be generating about $4.8 billion in net benefits to the sector as a whole. Yeah, maybe Carla, I'll let you, this is your favorite slide, so I'll let you jump in for the last couple.
All right, so we're getting close, and then there'll be time for questions, I'm hoping. And so really what this is intended to do is give you a sense of, to take away with you, and like I said, you'll be able to get a copy of the presentation. But it's a scenario where you can take a look at it, build what you in your crop and what your cropping decisions are, take it away and figure out what the potential costs for you would be. So in the middle there are potential costs if you choose to buy varieties that have royalties associated with them. As I said before, there would remain a choice for a considerable amount of time, and depending on how the system is designed, perhaps for a very, very long time, that your cost could be zero, right? But if you say, I'm just going to pick the medium farm range there, a farm with about 3,500 acres, say you're growing 1,200 acres of wheat, and you choose to grow, let's go 100% varieties with royalties associated with them. If it's about $1 per ton or $1.30 per acre, depends on what rate setting mechanism is ultimately selected, you would be looking at $1,560 annually for that. If you're in that same range and if it ends up being a variable rate and it lands at about $3 per ton or equivalently $3.90 per acre, then if you're growing 100% of those 1,200 acres of wheat you plant with varieties with royalties associated with them, you'd have a cost of about $4,680 for a year. So it's just it's not meant to be the answer for your particular acreage and how much wheat you grow. You'd have to take that, figure out based on how much you would want to perhaps grow of those sorts of varieties. And presumably, I'm guessing, you're all business people in this room. If you grow a variety that has a royalty associated with it, in anticipating that you're going to get a greater return, and you don't get that return, I'm guessing you're not going to go back to that place with your business the next year. And that is what market forces are about, right? So there's a built-in motivation for breeders and companies and public sector to really continue to deliver the highest varieties for you, and that you then will purchase whichever varieties are performing. So that's kind of a snapshot of potential cost. And then just the very last slide is just fundamentally some key takeaways. Then I'm done, and Anthony and I are happy to take comments and questions. So just a reminder, because there's a lot in here, and we flew through it. You know, again, we haven't landed on all of these details, but presumably based on international kind of models that are out there, and also what we've been hearing from folks across the country, costs would likely range between $1 to $3 per acre or per ton. And that would be on those varieties that have royalties associated with it. Zero cost for those that don't. And then royalty, this is something we should build in a little bit more in our presentations, but in essence, if you look at most breeding programs and most kind of folks who are in that game, you're looking at royalty revenue, and there is royalty revenue generated in Canada right now through certified seed. But that represents about 10 to 20% of overall cost. So there's a big investment gap there, and it gets bigger depending on who you are trying to get into that world. Reg-making authority, this is really critical point. Ultimately, any change here would have to be done through regulations. Built into that regulation-making process is a need to do more consultations, and there's a gazette process. But the fundamental point here is that there's tons of flexibility there. So if there is a desire, and we've heard it in many of these sessions, that there's producer input into a model moving forward, and that input be on a continuous basis. There is a way to build a mechanism into that regulation-making process where producers can have ongoing input. There's also a way to think about limits, right? If there's, okay, well, we're okay with paying royalties for a while, but can you introduce some sort of a limit? So there is a way in those regulations to think about flexibility. They're very flexible, and so those are just a couple of examples. But this is what this conversation is about: is to figure what is it that makes sense. And then finally, just to remind everybody, kind of what fundamentally is driving this conversation is that investments in breeding lead to results and returns and ultimately profitability for producers. And that's been demonstrated through many, many studies, time and time again. And I don't think we've ever heard otherwise from folks when we've presented. So that means yield gains, that means quality gains, whether it's disease resistance or other mechanisms that you need to adapt on your landscape, and end user functionality, which we were talking about earlier with your earlier panel. So with that, I would like to just turn it over to for questions and comments. If I could get this slide to advance. And if you don't get to ask your question or comment here, there's a couple of email addresses and you can send questions to.
Great, that's excellent presentation. Question right at the top. Yep. So we've got about 10 minutes, so if we could keep them to maybe under 2 or 3 each.
How soon will we have genetically modified wheat in Canada?
Okay, so I would say, 1, I don't know, but 2, it'll depend on the market, right? I think if the market ever decides to accept that, then that will be where you would perhaps see that happen. I think what's critical to this is that is not what we're talking about here. So we're talking about technological advancements. Like if you get a chance to talk with some of the breeding community, I'm not really the best person, but Limagrain, for example, looking at speed breeding, and then if you think about some of the other cool things I get to do in my job, which is look at big data and artificial intelligence and the digital kind of world, and just what that can do to bring to revitalize the breeding world and just advance it. So there's other mechanisms, I would say, beyond genetic modification that can advance plant breeding.
Kate, you'll get your steps in today. There's a couple guys over here.
Hi. I got a comment about your favorite slide. It says $1 per acre or $1 per ton, but I would have to double that for the last 5 years. Like, we're not growing 37 bushel acre wheat on good years here. So everything would be doubled when you grow 70 bushel wheat, right?
So like Anthony, it's really not my favorite slide, just so you know. It's more of a slide that is intended to give you a way to calculate. So you had great bushels. That's fantastic, right? So that means you're probably getting better returns. So yes, you would have to factor that in. What we used as bushel per acre was about 45 bushels per acre, which is on average what StatsCan quotes for kind of average yield. Clearly you're in a above average zone, and maybe you're there permanently. So yeah, you'd have to factor that into your costs. Whether it's per acre or per ton would depend on kind of what model is landed on, and also what conversation leads us to land on, right? So it's really important to hear kind of what the rate makes sense and how is it assessed, because percentage is another way that you could do it, right?
Just one more quick question. Did Australia have a grain commission that deregisters varieties for, sometimes to us it seems like for no reason, and if they deregister our good varieties we have now, we're forced into the new ones that all have royalties?
So that's a great question, and we've been asking our colleagues, I've been probing into Australia to see what's the nature of the registration process that they have. I don't have an answer yet, but we're hoping when we get to the online consultation we will. It has been raised in some of the sessions, the concern about, okay, you have these royalty-free varieties that are out there, will over time those get deregistered, and then you really don't have choice. And that is something that concerns us. So we've dug a little bit into the data. We've gone and looked at the total number of registered varieties across Canada for wheat, and that's 463 as of now. The number that actually held plant breeders' rights at one point in time and then got deregistered was 13 as of now. So that's about 3%. Actually, it's 2.8%. So quite a low number. Now, we recognize those are public sector varieties, so they're not likely to deregister anytime in the near future. Our way of sort of addressing that is we know that we have modernization of the seeds regulations coming up in the near future, in the next couple of years. So we want to look at perhaps a mechanism that can be balanced around deregistration, because I would also argue you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There might be some legitimate reasons for deregistering a variety. Let's say it's extremely susceptible to a certain disease, and that might cause market harm. Well, you might be in a position where you'd want to deregister that variety. However, on the flip side, if there's a variety that's still in market demand and the registrant is seeking deregistration of that variety, maybe there needs to be a balanced process to assess that and say, well, maybe there's a need to keep this variety on in the future. So it's something that through the conversations has cued us to look into it. We've been doing some digging of data, and we know in the future we'll have an opportunity to change the seed regulations, and that might be a good time to address that.
And maybe just to mention something, I think, so it's not a quick process to deregister, correct, Anthony? It's a three-year process, and there's nothing in the queue. That
2021.
Up until 2021, there's nothing in the queue. So that's it's not just a switch of the light switch there to deregister a variety either, right? And then also is one of the key takeaways that probably should have landed on that end slide is that any system, any model in Canada would be a made in Canada model. That was a clear recommendation coming out of the Value Creation Working Group. One of those distinctions in Canada is that public sector prominence is critical. So that public sector prominence coupled with private sector, and that will help to ensure those varieties not getting deregistered quite, in that manner. So.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. My question, two quick questions and one comment. What kind of collaboration from our farmers and farm organizations would be required for an alternative funding model based on collective funding and public funding leveraging be required? Also, with your two presented models, how will you address slippage, administration, and moral hazard? And my comment is with regards, how can you ensure that producers are not signing a blank check, and is the portion of status quo acceptable?
Oh, there's a lot of questions. Okay, I'm going to start. There's like 4 questions, I think, in there, and I wrote down 3. So you'll have to remind me if I miss one. So I think your first one was around partnerships, and how is it that perhaps there could be a way to enter into partnerships and continue to have that producer involvement. I think partnerships are a critical part of the path forward. I think right now it's challenging for some partners to come to the table because there's no way for those particular partners to get a return on the investment to even be at the table. So that's that bit. I think in terms of like, how do you avoid costs becoming just skyrocketing? Or I think is kind of where you were headed. I think that's the very reason why, well, it is the very reason why we're having these conversations, so there can be input and involvement in the details. And also, you know, if you say land in a model where there is producer involvement in an ongoing basis, well, you would have a say kind of on and how things could evolve. That's why I mentioned limitations. And so these are the very things we need to hear from you, that those are really critical aspects. And so we'll take that away and think about how could that be incorporated. And then status quo was the third one, and I don't remember the fourth, so you'll have to remind me, and maybe Anthony remembers, but status quo. So I would think probably the way to best depict a future is if there's no change, that's always possible. No change is always possible. I would say that it's very hard to have a world stay static, so I can't guarantee you that the world will be exactly the same way it is before the conversation as after the conversation, but certainly no change is always an option in any kind of consultation of this nature. So Anthony, I think you...
Yeah, and I think there was another element there about producer involvement on an ongoing basis, and this is something we've been giving a lot of thought to. And we actually have tools under the existing legislation that might help us moving into the future if a model comes into place, and that is something called the Plant Breeders' Rights Advisory Committee, and that's appointed by the Minister of Agriculture. In law currently it says it must have breeders, both public and private, it must have the seed trade and seed growers, and it must have farmers represented on that committee. And really the objective of that committee is to, and it says this in law, is to assist me as commissioner in delivery of the intellectual property regime. So this element of producer ongoing involvement in governance and oversight and monitoring to ensure that we get the outcomes we want, but also ensuring that we get that right balance of incentivizing breeders to innovate and get a return on investment, but also ensuring that producers share in those benefits and it grows their profitability as well. So that's something we've been giving a lot of thought to as a potential mechanism for that ongoing producer involvement.
Okay, we have time for one more.
Hello.
No, we don't.
Yes. Briefly, very quickly, my name is Ian Robson. I'm with the Farmers Union. We have followed the Seed Synergy document. We encourage everybody to read that Seed Synergy document, which all this discussion is based upon. One of the things missing in that document is the status quo, which has only been mentioned on one slide, basically, if I got my notes right on today's presentation. But everybody needs to understand what the status quo is, and that is everybody pays and everybody benefits. And that's because of the public dollars that are involved in their plant breeding and crop research, and that have done significant innovation, significant return on investment for everybody as soon as those dollars are spent, and there are resulting varieties that we know those varieties have benefited us today. Brandon wheat has been the popular variety. Much of that work was done at Agriculture, Ag-Food Canada and universities, and any royalty return that goes back, a small part of that might go to the Ag Canada, but there's a little bit will go to a private investor who might own that variety. And that's the problem. We're overpaying in that royalty process, and we need another option entirely from these two options of endpoint royalty and trailing royalties that have been described today. And I encourage the Commission, Farmers Commission, to not involve themselves with this discussion anymore, and encourage the Government of Canada to add more money and do more research on our behalf and own those seeds, so that when we buy those seeds, we don't have to pay anybody a royalty. As soon as the breeder does the work, the innovation is automatic.
Okay,
The value
so,
is,
thanks, Ian.
value is
Sorry to-
automatic.
sorry to
for it.
try to
Understand
cut you
that
off.
I understand, but I understand that we need that value too. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Okay, could you please, if you could please join me in thanking Carl and Anthony. That was a very informative session. Thank you very much. We have a small gift for you. Okay, Anthony.